Thanks for having me. And thank you for all the decisions that led you to be here, including maybe the chances and the surprises. The last three speakers, I think, really primed us for, or primed me, I should say, for my discussion on culturally integrative psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, specifically honoring my lineage with Jewish American elderly. Yes, I flew actually from Florida on Wednesday from the 4,000 miles to be here and talk on a very different land from where I'm from. And that in itself is a very unique lived experience of transporting and displacement. I'll get into it. So just before I dive into the details, I want to give an overview of where we're headed, a blueprint about me, about the intentions of the research that I've conducted, the literature that informed and maybe inspired further exploration into the gaps, things to take into consideration when doing psychotherapeutic psilocybin-assisted work, and hopefully then towards a model of doing this, psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. About me, I actually really wanted to put photos of my family throughout the slides. And in fact, didn't want to do slides at all. But last minute, I decided I'll use the blueprint that I had thusly created for clinical presentations. So that's me. That's usually where you can find me, doing one of those two things. Broadly, in 2012, I had a spiritual emergency. However, clinicians may call it something else, which inspired my straddling between two or multiple worlds of psychedelic ceremony, plant medicine ceremony, and clinical psychology. In 2018, I had a San Pedro ceremony where I met many of my ancestors, hundreds of them of all different walks of life. And in one of those moments, one that I know, my grandfather on my mom's side, came in very strongly. And he said, either you're going to be a rabbi or you're going to go into psychology, but stop putzing around and choose one. Putzing is like Yiddish for stop messing around. He wasn't Jewish, but that came through. And I putzed around for 3 more years in fine art and design. And while beautiful, I would never really forget that message. So COVID came. I had done several years of really immersing myself in plant medicine worlds in Florida specifically. That's the only land that I've done plant medicine ceremonies on, specifically Santo Daime, Umban Daime, and Red Road traditions. Yeah, COVID happened, and my family on this plane and also those elsewhere said, "I'm to, stand at the fork in the road and choose." So I went to Northwestern University in Chicago's program for clinical mental health, and at that same time continued to attend ceremony while studying traditional psychotherapy and psychology at this, primarily Hopper Research University, and was living half the time with my grandparents. So every ceremony that I did in South Florida was always prefaced and afterwards followed by visiting my grandparents, which was just always a very interesting before and after prep and unwind. Yes, and so here I then start interning at Life Adventures Counseling, primarily out of Florida, again. And I like to call what I'm doing right now psychedelic-assisted psychodynamic therapy. Psychodynamic is an analog or a cousin or many generations after psychoanalysis. So we're not talking Freud, but we're talking about evolutions afterwards. So yes, family of origin is big, and yes, how the past informs the present, but not so much the symbolic interpretations, more or less. And I say psychedelic assisted in quotes because in Florida, that is not legal whatsoever. Psilocybin, plant medicine, not legal in Florida. So coming here to a very different audience changes the entire tone of my presentation. I don't have to give a lot of backstory. I don't have to give a lot of reasons why I'm doing this. So I'll say that. My specialties currently are complex trauma, intergenerational, psychedelic integration for, in quotes, personality disorders. In quotes for a reason. most of the clients that I've had so far come to me from different lands, immigrated or assimilated into Florida, and have had challenging psychedelic experiences that they don't know how to, in their words, make meaning from or move forward with. And also racial, queer trauma topics, and alternatively music and sailing therapies. And in addition, some Jungian, and I say Jungian in quotes too, for Jewish identity processing. So the initial intention of this research are threefold. Cultural components of healing are infused in both the therapist and client's understanding of an issue and how to treat it. The proposed psilocybin-assisted therapy model moves from doing therapy to ways of being in relationship. And all the while, I wanted to stay in my lane, so honoring my family and Reform and moderate Ashkenazi Jewish American, and also my maternal Christian line as a result. So the literature, broadly speaking, humans across all cultures and time have engaged with plants for healing purposes for a variety of reasons, including biblical Jewish times and before. And Western psychotherapy, by contrast, incorporates only what may be convenient in religion and healing traditions. A great example of this was brought to my attention by Cindy Blackstock, a social worker, and Cross, when she and they explained that Maslow's hierarchy of needs was actually developed when he first observed First Nation elders on their land, and he came up with this model of what it means to live right. And of course, that's very well known now in the States of like, oh, the things we need for our needs met are food, water, shelter, and then we self-actualize. Well, these indigenous researchers then came back and responded by saying, no, actually, it's more like concentric rings of a tree. And in the middle of these rings is a core one, and that's spirituality, meaning how we do these things on the broader rings, how we seek out the food, water, shelter, etc., is couched and infused by our understanding of spirituality and what it means to be the source. And as Marlena described earlier, there have been recent few decades worth of research in clinical trials specifically looking at psilocybin and patients with terminal cancer experiences at end of life. So what does that mean? Their conclusions have shown to reduce existential distress, death anxiety, suicide ideation, while improving quality of life in various ways. And the key that I highlight here is as mediated by spiritual experience. So they got better, or they reduced their death anxiety by having spiritual experiences induced by psilocybin. The gaps in this literature are manyfold, and particularly not just in language, but in action. So in the measurements used and also in the conclusions resulting are discussing how psilocybin has occasioned mystical experience. That's great. But what does that mean? What does that mean for different people? We're talking about having these experiences in a hospital, and populations that are not described based on their religious or ethnic or racial affiliations, or at least they may be documented, but it's not gone into explicitly. The few studies which do center non-white and non-Christian populations explicitly find that the healing narratives clients come in with or come out of the experience with are suffused in cultural languaging. So African-American patients, for example, with Dr. Williams, the clients are saying that they healed certain parts of their experience through, say, narratives of strength, and in the conclusions they language resilience, for instance, through racial trauma. So these spiritual experiences are one and the same with the shadows of racial trauma, for instance. It's not, oh, I just talked to God. So getting deeper with what that means. And also huge gaps then too of what that means for Jewish populations. That is nowhere in the literature that I've seen. Jewish populations have specific cultural anxieties pertaining to death, the beliefs about what happens when we move forward, not to mention how we live before that. And also, it should be really, really mentioned, and things that I came up in my own study in university is Western therapeutic orientations were told as truth, like Jungian, Freudian, actually have some shadows of anti-Semitism. So what do we do with that? Some clinicians say, well, we can't throw out the entire thing. We should respect certain parts of the ideas, but maybe we divorce from the founder. or, you know, we take it with its context in time. And, you know, it's a point in time, that's one person, we learn and we grow and we move forward. But how deep does that bias and anti-Semitism and discrimination go? Right? We saw it earlier with the images of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's couched as like if you're going to propose any model to a client in the room, you go with that one. But that's not even accurate, right? So it's concerning where our thoughts are coming from. So maybe all of us in the room know why this is important, but when I present this to clinical psychology groups at university, at research, that you typically don't have psychedelic experience almost whatsoever, they want to know, why is this at all important? Well, it's important because we must explore why we even seek to know how plant medicine works, right? That idea of what works and how it's utilized is already describing something about how can it help us humans? How can it help us humans heal and our self-development, right? And also the way we are researching how it works is couched in medicalizing and secularizing the spiritual experiences that were said to occasion health and healing and wellness, right? So if we're sort of whitewashing, secularizing cultural and religious tradition, what happens? Well, we're continuing to enable the Western's propensity for control, extraction, disconnection, cures at the root of what I believe is the modern symptomology of psychological disorder. You see depression, anxiety, personality disorders. Slowly, you can walk it back to these Western propensities. Therefore, if we can't upend the causes of modern illness, we can't uproot modern illness, right? We can't, if we can't identify what the core crux of these illnesses are, we're just aiding and abetting the systems that are designed to promote these disorders. So culturally informed counseling stance, what does that look like? And know that this is typically presented to counselors. There's a lot of research that debates what's the best therapy out there. You know, you have CBT, you have DBT, you have psychodynamic, you have a whole list of different alphabet soup. What's the best one? If I'm going to invest some money into this for your study, which one's going to be best? Well, a lot of studies have shown that there's no significant difference in client outcome across treatment approaches. What is shown to promote successful, helpful healing outcomes for clients is the therapeutic alliance. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but that basically means the counselor-client relationship and their understanding of why they're here. And also bringing it back to First Nation elders. Shaw 2017 describes that Canadian Indigenous wellness frameworks emphasize community orientation and non-interference in their therapies that promote healing. What does that mean? The counselor doesn't give advice on what to do or how to move forward. And an understanding of we're in this together. So decentralizing the clinician's power, in a sense, diffusing that to be 2 less people in the room. And it should be said, original talk interventions, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, talk-specific interventions, emphasize non-interference. We're not meant to give advice. We're not meant to ask leading questions. We're here to be present. And we're here to be present as 2 people who are hopefully transformed as a result of our dynamic. So maybe you're starting to hear similarities between therapy, true therapy, and ceremony with plant medicine. There's also something called counselor effects in therapy, which is how the counselor impacts the client's outcome. Counseling field debates that counselor effects are the single most influential factor in a client's outcome. Essentially, I think that means, in my own language, that the container of therapy is the counselor's medicine. We could say that the most influential factor of plant medicine is this so-called ritual effects I'll describe, or in another way to mention it, culture-bound set-in settings and containers. Likewise, in both therapy and ceremony, race, ethnicity, culture, religion are said to be psychosocial inner set-in settings. I wanted to name this presentation Therapy is Dead, if we let it, but my advisor said that was tone deaf. So I went with the very, whole appropriate title, but basically I really wanted to aim at, what is our real reason for being in the therapeutic room? What's our real goal here? It's to learn how to die. It's to learn how to live gracefully and die gracefully. And, my Jewish grandmother's medicine in her own way, when I'm like, I really don't want you to go. She's 89. I really don't want you to go. I'm going to miss you. She just says directly, we are born to die. She said that this week before I left. And I'm like, you're right. You're right. So moving back into the literature, psychedelics may have potential to alter so-called very stable personality traits via the spiritual or religious experiences that I mentioned, therefore upending theories of personality as we know it. I mean, that's really huge in psychology. If you think about personality disorders, BPD, NPD, narcissism, histrionic, all of them, and we say that those are no longer persistent and chronic and for the rest of your life, that in and of itself alters all kinds of ways that we treat and be in a room and destigmatizes what it is we're actually in there to do. Our entire motives and beliefs switch around by that idea alone. Bringing that to end of life, Erikson, famous psychologist, theorized that at end of life, that stage is characterized to be a reconciliation of ego integrity or sense of wholeness versus despair. So reconciling between this is the end and this sucks and death is just, just a terrible thing to do versus I've come to a sense of wholeness about my life and my death and I lived a good life, right? That's the end of life stage. So coupling these together, this allows for a reconsideration of what we even move towards in therapy, what we even do in the room and how we even show up. Like she said, we are born to die. So if we understand how psilocybin may affect mental health outcomes, so Jewish elderly, let's say, at end of life, how plant medicine reframes conceptions of wellness and illness, how religious and cultural experiences mediate the end of life stage of despair and ego integrity, we have the capacity with this type of medicine and therapy to upend fundamental psychology theory and orientations as we know it. Super huge. As long as we let that happen, as long as we allow ourselves to explore that deeply. So let's talk about decolonizing. I put decolonizing in quotes for therapy because I'm not quite sure that can ever really be decolonized. The DSM, for instance, was invented in 1952, specifically to help clients improve their careers, was originally how counseling formed. It's very new and it's born in American capitalism, right? Decolonizing research, shout out Linda Tuhiway Smith and others. My paraphrase of their work is, if we can stop extracting and looking for evidence or proof, then we show rather than tell the client what it is we seek them or we ask them to explore, which is we ask them to explore within. How can we ask a client to explore what's going on within them if we ourselves need answers without, right? I think it's very paradoxical. And if we come into the room modeling always secure attachment, how it is to be in a relationship, what it means to communicate, let's also go deeper and say, I trust my medicine, I trust my answers, and not only mine, my community, my family. Further unraveling the colonialist mindset and always never far behind anti-Semitism. So these clinical industries, pharmaceutical, psychedelic, psychedelic-assisted therapy, counseling in general, is really set on finding the best type of therapy out there to, pair like wine with psychedelic journeying. That's great, but my take on this, which doesn't always land well, is beware of the best trap of fixing and finding the best right thing to do. Remember what I said earlier about the strength of the therapeutic alliance to be in a relationship. And also, in my opinion, this is speaking in research language, if it's not cross-culturally valid, it's not evidence-based. And that's language that's, you know, it's psychology speak for how can we get funding from investors, meaning, okay, if DBT is evidence-based, our evidence shows that this works for clients for this amount of weeks, for this amount of time, it produces 20% reduction in depression symptoms. But you're not saying that that works for Jewish populations, Native populations, African-American populations, and we're just saying it works for everybody. I don't think your evidence is valid. Extending that further to my lineage of Judaism on my dad's side, the biodiversity of Judaism. I like to kind of play on that word a bit. Each plant medicine's mechanism of healing is as diverse as the mechanisms for wounding, so for trauma, for injury, and as such, the moderators of the social cultural trauma, so religious experience, family, etc. How a certain plant medicine impacts wellness outcomes between various Jewish sects and geography, I think will also vary, like each plant and harvest tradition. Like all plants come in with, let's say, a personality if we're going to anthropomorphize them. And each Jewish sect in every different Jewish land and geography, as we know it, is completely different. I mean, I've had extremely different experiences compared to the panel we saw earlier. There are no monoliths in plant life, in Jewish life, in counseling. This was something very interesting. I was walking in the dead of winter around Chicago and thinking, how am I going to put all this together? These thoughts are not connecting. And I know what I mean, but how the heck do I tell this to a research community? And this idea, this maybe voice message, I don't know, came in and said the spirituality of consent. Spirituality of consent. That sounds really cool, but what does that mean? I wrote it down in my iPhone notes. I kept thinking about it for months. I did a self-psilocybin trip and kind of thought about it, put it away because I didn't know what to do with it. And then I walk into the library. I take these, let me get lost in the library and see what I find. That's how I do my research. And I came across Christopher Columbus's logs on his ship. And I didn't know I would find this, but I read the whole thing. It was like 300 pages for one of the expeditions. And particularly in this passage, 15th of March, 1493, he talks about, even using the word, his consent, his in capitalized, meaning God's, and how this mission was divinely inspired and right in order to heal the savage people that he was going to, become in a relationship with. So he felt like he was really acting under God's will, right? To heal and deliver healing to savage peoples. Yikes. Okay. Well, moving forward, clients consent to therapy without knowing the scope of spiritual or religious influence of therapy orientations. So like I said, if you have a Jungian therapist or a psychodynamic therapist who's not aware of the anti-Semitic undertones in that orientation, the client definitely isn't, yet they're consenting to that. They're not really fully informed in their consent. 2, psychotherapists must be careful not to feel justified in adopting psychedelic medicine and retrofitting it into how they think healing works. You see that now in this psychedelic renaissance of, oh, I do IFS, psychedelics pair really well. I know how to put those two together. For all my clients, it's going to be great. Well, I also think in the Jewish traditions, and kind of like the panels talked about, if we're retrofitting our narratives back onto biblical experiences, let's say the burning bush, and calling it a psychedelic vision, it might have. It also might not have, but we're using our own biases to look at that. So that's this caveat I preface when we move into psychedelic-assisted therapy is you might get initiated too early, put it that way. And also with Christopher Columbus's ships, within this, he talks about abundance for his Lord and his King. Money is also associated with spiritual motivation and clinical ones too. So then moving towards a psychedelic-assisted therapy model, how do we even do this appropriately and ethically then? And that one that's culturally informed. I haven't seen one out there, and this is what kind of came to me as I was writing the conclusion of the paper. It's up for debate and it's up for the community to talk about. And figure out what it means, what we should really do about it. So this came through from me, but I put it out to everyone. Remember, return, and reconcile. Oh, that's vague. What does that mean? Return home to the wisdom found within all beings. Remember true nature, the true intentions and ways of counseling in Judaism and in medicine. And reconcile, relationship, and our relationship with how we do counseling in this field, in this industry. So how I practice this. I return home. I believe therapy is a Jewish tradition. Many founders themselves are Jewish. Finding home or homelands and displaced identities, and integrating the land, no land syndrome for Jewish populations. We remember true nature, that rabbis and Kohanet priestesses divinated for the sake of this community rather than the citizens themselves. Therapy's true nature in and of itself is to just be present and develop insight. Whether or not that comes with change and transformation, it doesn't really matter, although it usually does. We're just here to be present and see together. And I believe therapy itself is ceremony. There's always more than two people in the room. We bring our family and community across all of time into every session. All parties are transformed when we reconcile. You know, I had a friend after an ayahuasca ceremony talk about how he thinks he's an alien, he doesn't want to be on this earth anymore, and he hates all the systems that we have to live in. And I said, you know, you think we're all one, right? We're all connected. Yeah. And I'm like, well, then we're also the systems that we hate. So the sense of really coming back to the systems that we seek to separate from and reconcile what that means to be here in them with acceptance. And also in Florida, since I do psychedelic-assisted medicine there, but I can't deliver that medicine to my clients. I can't even refer them or recommend them to a source. How I do it is I'm sitting with medicine, either maybe in session, not usually, but typically in my own time and community. I go back and process what's brought into the room outside of it and get a sense really deeply for what they're going through or what I'm experiencing as a result. And I feel that when I do this, they're also touched by the medicine, and their families and my family are touched by the medicine. I don't think that they even need to touch it in order for it to be considered psychedelic assisted, which also helps ecologically and with preserving the actual plants too. The sense that it's not everybody who needs to touch it in order to transform. And also I see a lot of integration challenges. So clients will come to me having really intense psychedelic visions and not know at all how to interpret it. And I have to go into their world with them, you know, client from Latin America, a client from the Caribbean islands, living in Florida, for instance, assimilated themselves, right? That's already displacement and a deintegration from their lands. And now they're coming and having another type of deintegration, right? Like really going into the culture-bound set and settings of them, the client, myself, and also ceremony and therapy. All of these together, if they're not aligned, I think those are really part of the crux of why we see mental health challenges after the journey. So again, reducing harms with the clinician taking the medicine rather than the client, possibly even during the therapy session. The clinician can sit with them also outside to gain understanding and empathy for client defenses. You know, therapists will say, I have such a really difficult client, I just can't get through to them. Well, you can all kind of jump the barriers, if you will, with psychedelics for the clinician, or really deeply understanding what it means to be in their world. So that's it with Grandfather Fire. Yeah. Thanks.